The issue of whether to allow Syrian refugees into the U.S. is becoming increasingly divisive in the aftermath of the Paris attacks. The Senate vowing to block passage of the American Safe Act, which was passed by the House and calls for stronger vetting of the refugees. Joining us now is Republican Congressman Bob Goodlatte, and chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. He supports the House measure. Congressman, thanks so much for being with us this morning. Tell me just exactly where you are on the refugee issue, because I know that originally you wanted a moratorium on all Syrian refugees, but now you've backed off that somewhat, and you just want more strict vetting. So do you believe in letting Syrian refugees into the country over the next year?
Well, I think that we should hit the pause button. We should have a delay in admitting Syrian refugees until the FBI director certifies that the screening process works, and as the legislation which the House passed calls for, the FBI director and the Secretary of Homeland Security and the Director of National Intelligence certify that each refugee coming into the United States is not a national security risk. I think that is a very common sense, practical approach to addressing this problem, and I'm glad that the House had a very strong, very bipartisan vote.
Yep.
By the way, the Senate itself hasn't deliberated on this yet, so I hope that the senators will actually vote to allow the legislation to go to the floor of the Senate for a vote, rather than simply, as Senator Reid has threatened to do, block it from even being considered.
Well, as you know, the administration believes that this is overkill. President Obama says that Syrian refugees are the most vetted group of people let in. It takes 18 to 24 months of paperwork and vetting for them to get into the country. So really, what more do you want to have happen?
I simply want the FBI director to certify that the process works. He testified before the House Judiciary Committee in response to my question that there are major difficulties with vetting people from Syria because of the disarray in the country and because of the fact that there is no feasible means of communicating with the government on the basis of individual refugees, nor is there the ability to go in and interview neighbors and business associates and so on about whether people are indeed national security risks. That's unlike most other countries in the world where the United States has an embassy and has people on the ground, consular offices that can perform that kind of work.
Let me show you a study done by the Migration Policy Institute that puts the numbers in perspective. They say that there have been 784,000 refugees resettled in the U.S. since 9/11. Only three of those have been arrested for planning terrorist activities, and those they describe that were arrested, the plan was barely credible. So those are extremely low odds in terms of letting Syrian refugees in, or any refugees in. So why doesn't that give you comfort?
Well, because the FBI director said there are major problems, and of all those refugees, only a tiny percentage so far. I would say, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but last year about 1,600 or 1,700 were admitted from Syria. So far this year, about 200. And if the FBI director certifies, as the House passed bill, that this problem has been resolved, and they certify that each of the refugees is not a national security risk, that is not an unreasonable burden to bear, given that the United States, as you point out, the number of refugees, we are by far the most generous nation on earth in admitting refugees to this country. 2/3 on an average year of the UN recommended refugees from around the world are admitted to the United States, and 1/3 to all the other countries in the world. So we have nothing to apologize for in the generosity of our refugee system, but we also have a legitimate concern when, and it's not just the FBI director, by the way, other national security leaders have talked about the difficulty of vetting Syrian refugees. So I think this is a practical measure that the House is and the Senate should do the same thing.
Well, some of the things that the national security directors and Director Comey, who you're citing, have said is that, yes, there's nothing that is completely without risk, of course, but that they do believe that they have lowered the risk. In fact, they've lowered it dramatically since 9/11, and that they're feeling comfortable with the direction that it's going in, the vetting process is going in. But on a larger point, what President Obama has said is that the message that it sends to shut out Syrian refugees from the U.S., who is seen as being a generous country and having open arms, that the message it sends to the world is more dangerous than letting the refugees in?
Well, then the president ought to lead. He ought to get out and point out to the rest of the world that the United States is by far the most generous nation on earth with regard to admitting refugees into this country. And if his FBI director will certify that the program works as called for by the legislation passed by the House, he shouldn't have any concern by that.
Yeah.
But if he says it's too onerous because the director won't certify it, then quite frankly, I think the president needs to look in the mirror in terms of how the United States looks to the rest of the world.
So, Congressman, if not here to the mainland of the U.S. for the refugees, where? Where do you recommend the Syrian refugees who have to get out of their country because it is so war-torn, where should they go?
Well, I've visited refugee resettlement areas in Jordan, and the United States, again, by the way, is by far the most generous nation on earth in terms of supporting, taking care of Syrian refugees in Jordan, in Turkey, and we certainly would be willing to provide resources wherever they may be needed to keep them safe while this situation remains not just unresolved, but in total disarray in their own country. The overwhelming majority of them want to return to their home country. We should focus on what it's going to take to that happens so that when it does, they'll be able to return home. We have 45 million, according to a recent study, displaced persons around the world who cannot live in their homes because of various reasons. And addressing those reasons is far more important to me than it is trying to figure out how to move 45 million people around the world. So to me, national security needs to be a consideration, but taking care of refugees where they are needs to be an important consideration as well.
Congressman Goodlatte, thanks so much for being on New Day.